but I'm afraid ideology is taking over a lot.
In general or in architecture?
In general, but also in architecture and in aesthetics, a kind of a purist approach.
Well, for example, when people talk about visual pollution, I think that very often is an ideological statement, because you can measure chemical pollution. How do you measure visual pollution? It's usually someone else's house. There's often a class-based prejudice involved in what's called visual pollution.
Yeah, and you feel then that it's usually some sort of an elitist position that's being propounded perhaps indirectly in that sort of.
Yes, although I would say this, not only elitists dislike strips. Many other people dislike strips too.
But would you say that there's a certain type of person that tends to go into architecture that perhaps is, I mean, obviously to be a good architect you have to be very precise, somewhat fastidious, I would imagine, an ability to think abstractly, and that those qualities...
I think those are stereotypes. Architects don't think abstractly very well. They
really?
think concretely.
Yeah, I guess so. They have to translate, but first they have to think abstractly.
Not necessarily, but many architects, they love the immediacy of what they're doing, and then there's also the whole construction side of things, the dirty boots side, which lots of people love, including us.
Yeah.
So I don't think the need, I think architects have to learn to think conceptually, but I think it starts out difficult for them.
But I think among architects there can maybe inherently be a danger concerning, you must have an aesthetic ideal and that you follow, and that's easy. And that can often be dangerous. And really good artists are not purists. And Palladio was not that way. Michelangelo was not that way. The great architecture of England and those architects were architects that allowed for mannerist accommodation and for breaking the rules, as we say.
But would you say that in our society today, perhaps because of the difficulty of getting oneself known and ideas out, there is a need, or architects feel the need to simplify and sell something that is more simpler and maybe more ideological than ideally one would want?
When you're talking about so-called signature architects, I agree. And so then the signature buildings tend to be simple and ideological buildings, which is a shame.
But those are the ones we know about. I mean, those are the ones and the names that we are familiar with.
Yes. And of course, it's a function of the clients too. We've just done a hospital in Lehigh Valley Hospital, Muhlenberg Hospital. And it's not simple. It's a very beautiful building that looks like a building. You might think it's quite ordinary. And then but it's got a great big blue H in front, and you actually walk under the H to go into the building.
It stands for hospital.
Oh, and how terrific.
When you get inside, it's got lots of public space that is right there at the entrance and leads off in different directions, and is complex. It's got a big plasma screen telling you about the hospital. And well, that's not a signature client or a signature architect. They just plain adore the building because it works for them and it feels happy. Well, that's ideal. What more would you want than that? But museums at the moment want much more than that.
Absolutely. I was just
building has to swoop.
Museum of Modern Art about that.
Museums have to have in America. They have to have foreign architects. They won't.
I wondered about that.
They won't hire you anymore. Oh. I'm changing my name to Roberto Venturi.
Okay. I wonder, Denise, if you could address. I mean, we're talking about stereotypes and so forth in architects, but it is true, wouldn't you say, that there aren't very many, at least high-profile women architects, or haven't been? Mm-hmm. And I wonder why that is, and if you feel that has been a detriment to the field in any way. I mean, I know we can't generalize too much about gender, but the absence of women on the highest level, I mean, you're an exception, it seems to me. How have you felt about that?
Well, when I started architecture, and the 3 countries I studied in, the ratio was 1 woman to 12 men. And I loved that ratio. Who wouldn't?
Yeah.
All that attention that I got. I'd be the only woman there, and I'd be the one noticed by people. And things like that. And then I began to realize that that doesn't work. And if all women don't go up, then I won't either. Yeah. And I really have to have another outlook about sharing this field with other women. And I've very strongly felt that ever since. And now in the schools, it's about 50-50. Yeah. But in the field, it's still, at the high levels, there's a strong glass ceiling. Now, part of it is biology, and we have to admit that. It's very difficult for women to bear children and to be project managers in an architect's office because you have to have such weird hours. Mm-hmm. We're about to go off to Fort Worth, Texas, and the client gave us about a week's notice, that's all, and it's a wonderful job. Mm. And we have to leave on Sunday, and we have to stay on Monday, and then we're taking with us a young woman who's got 2 kids. And she said, well, I could only spend 1 night away. Uh-huh. And then she discovered the dinner was on the second night. She said, I have to spend the second night away. Mm. Well, the family suffers from that, and we don't want to cause that. But so that's why some women say, we're just not going to do that. I can't do that. And that's one of the reasons. But then there's also huge prejudice against women.
I would imagine.
The first woman to win a Pritzker Prize happened 23 years, I think it's 23 years
Pritzker,
after the first Pritzker
architecture?
Yes, after the first prize was given.
Really?
It took 23 years for them to find a woman who fits the mold that to them means great architecture. Now, I criticize their criteria enormously, but the fact that they couldn't bend their criteria, they couldn't see other ways of being an architect, they couldn't say maybe there are various streams, is one of the reasons. But the other reason is that it's very difficult for a woman to get to be head of her firm, and for all these reasons, and also for getting clients. And I think that the ones who will get that prize will be from outside of America.
Really? Because those cultures are more conducive?
Yes. It's a 19th century upper middle class men's club at the high levels, still in America. And there's a lot of bitterness at those high levels among men about the role of women.
In other domains?
No, I mean in
architecture itself.
Yes.
So you're saying that America in some ways is more backward than many European countries.
And take a developing area. If a woman gets an architectural education, she's pretty rich, and she's from a powerful family, and the power of the family supports her rather than her sex.
Okay, which we don't have in this
yes.
country. That's interesting. I wondered what you thought about, John Ruskin, the 19th century writer, had said he was very much interested in the way architecture reflected the health of the culture. And of course his ideal was medieval architecture, where he felt the craftsman was very much involved in the making of the Gothic cathedral and therefore was more alive to the work than the 19th century industrial worker. But he was very, very aware of how architecture worked as a social, a reflection of the society. And I wonder what you think about this. I mean, you're certainly so much, and Denise, as an urban planner and as a contextualist, so aware of context. What do you think about buildings today and politics or the health of the society as a whole? Do you think we're in a healthy state as seen through our architecture?
First of all, Ruskin talked about how bad Hindu art reflected the cunning and dishonesty of that society, if I remember right. And so the racism and all of that is just horrendous.
He had his racist moments, that's true.
And my social scientist friends would just say it's very highly unscientific to make those kinds of connections between. Now, I think that a form grows up out of a society. And in some levels, all urban forms have things in common, just because of the geometry of the circle. When two roots meet, and there's a point of high intensity, that's where you want to put everything. So that's where the rent is high, that's where the buildings are high, and you get the shape of New York. The cusp of New York comes from the meeting of intense circulation systems and therefore high accessibility. So whether
so it's organic, you
yes,
say.
so whether
Yeah.
it's a medieval town or a Middle Eastern town or New York, it obeys the geometry of the circle, which is a fascinating idea.
One thing I would like to get in really quickly in this is, as architects and urban designers, we are inspired today in terms of cities mostly by, besides Los Angeles, by Tokyo and Shanghai, we could say.
You love those two
We love
cities.
those two cities.
Yeah.
And both of them, and one reason we love them is because it's just great vitality there, naturally economic, but also aesthetic and expressive vitality. And they acknowledge the coming together of cultures, of different cultures, of architecture as not just abstract purity, but especially Shanghai does this, but both of them do. And Shanghai has a history of that, of going back way over 100 years. And so the idea of bringing together many cultures is very appropriate for us today, and the idea of being impure and about how they come together is one way to make for cities that are jumping with vitality, and we would also say validity. And I just want to get that in.
I understand.
We learn
I'm
from
really
that.
beginning to understand your philosophies now that I've been. So where do you put New York in this? You haven't really mentioned New York City.
Well, New York was most exciting city. It's where our son went at the age of 17, and he's lived there ever since, and he loves it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's less the city of now than it was, I think. And
Why is that?
Well, I just think that's because there's more vitality in these other ones, and there is more the coming together of cultures. The American culture still predominates there, and it's fine. That's good. And we love Times Square. We call Times Square partly because we love architecture as communication, and there you find the urban element, which says, the essential thing is the signage, not the form and the space. So we love it, and we call it the equivalent of the Piazza San Marco
So you love those
in
big
Venice.
billboards
We
and
love
the
that.
Calvin
That's the architecture
Klein.
of now.
Okay.
But also you find that in these other cities all over the city, not just in the center, and that we think we learn very much. We learn very much from that, and are very stimulated by it. And this idea of coming together of cultures is so important to acknowledge the cultures. There's enormous universality that can exist at this time, and there's the opposite of enormous complexity of coming together of cultures, as I said, at the same time.
Well, I have to say, I mean, you had earlier said something about your being fogey-like or something, and I think you're the most forward-looking people.
We said we were boring.
You said you, but so, I mean, I guess what I take away, and you can contradict me if I'm wrong, that you seem to me to have an extremely optimistic view of culture and the possibilities for renewal, which I don't know that you find among artists and architects that much these days. I mean, you hear about the end of art and the end of history and the end of architecture, but you sound so optimistic about possibilities for always reinventing the space based on what's there. And I find that very wonderful and empowering to hear.
Great things can happen.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank you on behalf of Drexel and myself for being with us today at the Drexel interview. And thank you for joining us today for the Drexel interview.